Hello and welcome to this webinar with the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization, the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, and the Kaplan Center with the University of Cape Town. My name is Daniela Hofscha. I'm going to be your MC this evening. We are so glad to have you all with us. We will be beginning in just a few moments. We're going to wait just for a few people to join us. We've got quite a large crowd tonight. So if you would just allow us a few minutes to let our team in. You can, however, write in the chat. We'd love to know where everyone's coming from. We know we've got people here from South Africa, we've got people from America, people from all over the world, and we're always so happy to have all of you here tonight. So please do write in the chat where you're from. And again, we're just going to wait 1 or 2 more minutes and we will let everyone in and we will begin. So thank you all for joining us. We're letting people in. Tonight's topic, of course, the emergence of Holocaust consciousness and its permutations. We're incredibly excited for this event and for the series that we are running in collaboration with the Kaplan Center and the Posen Library. It's going to be a wonderful 3-part series. And if you have, and the good news is that if you have signed up for this one, you will immediately get reminders for the next 2. So you don't have to worry about signing up for those again. As I said, we're just letting a few more people in and then we will begin. Just some housekeeping before we begin. Please keep yourselves on mute throughout the event so we can let our brilliant speakers talk. If you have any queries, comments, or questions, you can write them in the chat. If you are having any technical difficulties, you can send a private message to the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center person that's in the corner at the very top there. And we will help you with everything we can and make sure this is a wonderful webinar experience for you this evening. This event is being recorded and will go up onto our YouTube channel. You are, of course, welcome to keep your video on, but if you do not prefer to have your face on the Zoom and then later on our YouTube, you are welcome to keep it off for the evening. So it'd be lovely to know where everyone's coming from. We're going to wait about 2 more minutes and we will begin. So I know there are some people here from South Africa, across Johannesburg, which is very chilly this evening. We're in for quite a long winter. We have wonderful people joining us from across the United States, people from all around the world, our members, our people who are new to the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center events, and we hope you will join us for many more in the future. We've got Christina, who's here from New York, and Tully from Johannesburg. So happy to have you. We've got someone joining us from China. Welcome. We're so glad you made time for us tonight to join this webinar. We're going to wait just 1 more minute, and then we will begin with what I'm sure is going to be an exceptional evening for all of us. Again, tonight's topic, Jewish culture and civilization, the emergence of Holocaust consciousness and its permutations. This is the first in a 3-part series, and we cannot wait for the series to unfold. The next event will be on the 7th, and the one after that on the 16th. So they're all coming to us within the next 3 weeks, and we are very, very proud and very happy to have these events and to be able to host them and bring them to you tonight. I think we are going to begin, if that's all right with everyone, and we will just allow more people to come in as they go. Again, this event is being recorded and will go up later, and everyone here tonight will receive a copy of the recording. And once again, please keep your microphones on mute throughout the event, and if you have any questions, comments, ideas, thoughts, you can write them in the chat. So to begin, I would like to introduce the director and founder of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, the wonderful Tully Metz.
Thank you so much, Danny, and welcome, a warm welcome from a very chilly Johannesburg to what is promising to be a very, very interesting 3-part series. The Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center is proud to partner with the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization, as well as the Kaplan Center for Jewish Studies and Research at the University of Cape Town. It is wonderful to have Deborah Dash Moore starting in this first part of the series, and of course to work with my colleague and my friend, Professor Adam Mendelsohn, the Associate Professor of History and Director of the Kaplan Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Cape Town. So a warm welcome to all of you and to all of you listening on the Zoom recording later on. Adam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tali. And it's my great pleasure this evening to introduce Professor Deborah Dash Moore. Deborah Dash Moore is the editor-in-chief of the Posen Library of Culture and Civilization and the Frederick G. Huetwell Professor of History at the University of Michigan. Her own work has been very wide-ranging and very influential. She has been a pioneer in several fields, writing path-breaking works exploring urban history, gender and history, the adaptations of second-generation Jews to American society, the lives of American Jewish soldiers in World War II, and the power and uses of numbers in contemporary Jewish life, amongst many, many other themes. Her most recent book, Jewish New York, The Remarkable Story of a City and a People, covers over 3 centuries of history and culture. In addition to serving as editor-in-chief of the entire series of the Posen Library of Culture and Civilization, she was also co-editor of volume 10 of the Posen Library, focusing on the late 20th century from 1973 to 2005. And tonight, Professor Deborah Dash Moore will speak to us about the emergence of Holocaust consciousness and its permutations. Thank you very much, Professor Deborah Dash Moore.
So thank you for that generous introduction, Adam. I want to first say a word or two about the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. And we actually have a lovely video that gives you a sense of what this ambitious project is about. It's a 10-volume compilation of material drawn, starting with biblical material all the way up to the 21st century, all of it available in English and available for free on the website. So Christina, do you think you could move the slide up? That would be great. And here is a short video. So that just gives you a sense of the Posen Library. It's available for free in South Africa, China, wherever you are located physically, and you just need to register. And what I would like to do this evening is to give you a sense of the diversity of materials under the rubric of responses to the Holocaust. And I want to actually start in the United States with Elliot Cohen, who was the first editor of Commentary magazine. Cohen was a brilliant guy, writer, editor, born in Des Moines, Iowa. He worked on something called the Menorah Journal, which was one of the first intellectual Jewish papers started at the beginning of the 20th century by Harvard students. And he was tapped in 1945 to be the person to edit a commentary magazine that was funded by the American Jewish Committee. And I want to read a bit from his opening statement as an editor, just because it gives you a sense of what people were thinking back in 1945. Right? So it is traditional, he writes, to begin a new magazine with brave declarations. If we do not, we trust we will be forgiven. We begin at a heavy moment with a sense of human destiny. Every schoolboy who listens to the radio knows that 1945 marks an epoch in world history. World War II has ended. The United Nations have won the greatest military victory of the ages. Yet we stand troubled and hesitant before the glorious era of peace which we have awaited so long, and which we now seem not to know how to deal with. As Jews, we live with this fact. 4,750,000 of 6 million Jews of Europe have been murdered. Right? This is 1945, he's writing. Not killed in battle, not massacred in hot blood, but slaughtered like cattle, subjected to every physical indignity, processed. Yes, cruel tyrants did this. They have been hurled down. They will be punished, perhaps. Yes, there were men and women in other lands who raised their voices in protest, who lent helping hands. But we must also record this fact. The voices were not many. The hands were not many. There was a strange passivity the world over in the face of this colossal latter-day massacre of innocents, whether Jews or other minorities. And we must face this fact too, that the kind of thinking and feeling that set loose this nightmare phenomenon still burns in many countries and lies latent in all. We have no gauge to measure the potentialities of this great Nazi secret weapon of World War II. But there are many, and they are not guided by personal hurt alone, who believe that here is a force that, in the political and social scene, can wreak destruction comparable to the atomic bomb itself. He's talking obviously about anti-Semitism. At this juncture, in the midst of this turbulence and these whirlwinds, we light our candle. Commentary. Surely here is an act of faith. Commentary is an act of faith in our possibilities in America. With Europe devastated, there falls here upon us in the United States a far greater share of the responsibility for carrying forward in a creative way our common Jewish cultural and spiritual heritage. And indeed, we have faith that out of the opportunities of our experience here, there will evolve new patterns of living, new modes of thought, which will harmonize heritage and country into a true sense of at-homeness in the modern world. Surely, we who have survived catastrophe can survive freedom too. Now, I begin with this excerpt from the opening November commentary, just to sort of take you back into that time period, to let you reckon with how it is that American Jews, which of course emerges as the largest Jewish community in the world at that point, how one of their intellectuals comes to understand what has happened in the war. The oblique reference to anti-Semitism, the numbers killed, what's known then in November of 1945. I want to now go to something that I'm sure you're all familiar with, and that is the diary of Anne Frank. Now, Anne Frank, of course, was hidden with her family for close to 2 years in Amsterdam. And she was arrested in August 1944, and sent to the Westerbork labor camp and then eventually to Bergen-Belsen, where she died of typhus. Her diary, however, survived her. It was saved by the person who had helped to hide them, and it was posthumously published in 1947, and then was translated into, at this point, 67 different languages, adapted for theater and film, and it's really become a kind of icon at this point of the Holocaust. I don't want to deal too much with the issue of the icon, except I want to point out that one of the things that comes out and is often quoted from Anne Frank's diary is her optimism and her belief in humanity. And one of the things that's rarely quoted in her diary is her sense of herself as a Jew. And in the Posen Library of Jewish Culture, there's a excerpt from the diary taken from April 11th, 1944, which is shortly before they were discovered. And I'll just read you a little bit of this. None of us have ever been in such danger as we were that night. God was truly watching over us. Just think, the police were right at the bookcase. The light was on, and still no one had discovered our hiding place. Now we're done for, I'd whispered at that moment. But once again, we were spared. When this invasion comes and the bombs start falling, right? April of 44, she's anticipating, it'll be every man for himself. But this time we feared for those good, innocent Christians who are helping us. We've been strongly reminded of the fact that we're Jews in chains, chained to one spot, without any rights, but with 1,000 obligations. We must put our feelings aside. We must be brave and strong, bear discomfort without complaint, do whatever is in our power and trust in God. One day, this terrible war will be over. The time will come when we'll be a people again and not just Jews. So her awareness of being Jewish is something that often was downplayed in an effort to universalize her experience and became really important, the universalization, to the popularity and the diary becoming a kind of icon itself. So from Anne Frank, I want to move to Andr Schwartz, who wrote in the 1950s one of the first novels that dealt with the Holocaust, a piece of fiction. He's French. I must admit, I remember reading it as a kid and being very moved by it. The novel exposed the Christian roots of Nazi paganism. It indicted the Vichy regime and penetrated into the very heart of darkness, that is to say, the gas chambers at Auschwitz. It provoked a major controversy in France and became actually an internationally best-selling novel there. So just a short selection from this. This is Schwartz imagining Auschwitz. When the gentle rabbi, wrapped in the scrolls of the Torah, was flung upon the pyre by the Romans for having taught the law, and when they lit the faggots, the branches still green, to make his torture last, His pupil said, "Master, what do you see?" And Rabbi Hanina answered, "I see the parchment burning, but the letters are taking wing." "Ah, yes, surely, the letters are taking wing," Ernie, the hero of the novel, repeated as the flame blazing in his chest rose suddenly to his head. With dying arms, he embraced Golda's body in an already unconscious gesture of loving protection. And they were found that way half an hour later by the teams of Sonderkommando responsible for burning Jews in the crematory ovens. And so it was for millions who turned from Luftmenschen into Luft. I shall not translate. So this story will not finish with some tomb to be visited in memoriam. For the smoke that rises from crematoriums obeys physical laws like any other. The particles come together and disperse according to the wind that propels them. The only pilgrimage, estimable reader, would be to look with sadness at a stormy sky now and then. And one of the things that he also did, Schwartzbar, is he deliberately takes the prayer which is said that praises God, and he inserts the words of the camps, just a couple of examples, and praised Auschwitz, be Majdanek, the Lord, Treblinka, and praised Buchenwald, be Mauthausen, the Lord, Belzec, and praised Sobibor, be Chelmno, the Lord, Ponary, and praised Theresienstadt, be Warsaw, the Lord, Vilna. This use of the names of these many, many camps integrated into a kind of liturgy actually moved from Schwartzbar's novels into some elements of the liturgy itself in Sidurim that were prayer books that were published after the Holocaust in the Reform and conservative traditions. So if we now move on to the next slide, just want to bring your attention to Isaac Bashevis Singer. Singer was not a survivor of the Holocaust. He emigrated in 1935 to the United States and began writing for the Yiddish Vorwärts in New York. And then after the Holocaust, Bashevis actively pursued the literary memorialization of Polish Jewry. And he did that through translation of his work into English and became probably the most read Yiddish writer. He was awarded various honors, including the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1978. Ironically, the corpus of his work translated into English far exceeds the corpus of his work published in Yiddish in book form. So from literature, I want to move now to history and to a very important and influential book written by Lucy Davidovich, an American writer. And the war against the Jews was deliberately provocative in the sense that it drew upon Jewish sources, not just on German sources. And in its argument about the character of Nazism and Nazi anti-Semitism. And I'll just read you again a short excerpt from this about the Jewish solution, the Jewish question. To this concept that the National Socialists adopted, they added one new element embodied in the word final. Final means definitive, completed, perfected, ultimate. Final reverberates with apocalyptic promise, bespeaking the last judgment, the end of days, the last destruction before salvation, Armageddon. The final solution of the Jewish question in the National Socialist conception was not just another anti-Semitic undertaking, but a meta-historical program devised with an eschatological perspective. It was part of a salvational ideology that envisaged the attainment of heaven by bringing hell on earth. To attain its heavenly hell on earth, the German dictatorship launched a war that engulfed the whole world. Over 35 million people were killed, more than half of them civilians. On the battlefields, 1 out of every 22 Russians was killed, 1 out of every 25 Germans, 1 out of every 150 Italians and Englishmen, 1 out of every 200 Frenchmen. The human cost of 2,191 days of war surpassed the losses of any previous war in the world. That war brought death to nearly 6 million Jews, 2 out of every 3 European Jews. Though 1/3 of them managed to survive, though the Jewish people and Judaism have outlived the Third Reich, the Germans nonetheless succeeded in irrevocably destroying the life and culture of East European Jewry. So here you have in this statement here a sense of the way in which the war against the Jews was integral to World War II. Previously, they had been separated. You have lots of histories of World War II written before Lucy Dawidawicz's book that, they mention, the murder of Jews, but it's not part of the war. And Dawidowicz makes this bold move of bringing the Holocaust right into the center of World War II. Just a tiny bit more from her. Never before in modern history had one people made the killing of another the fulfillment of an ideology in whose pursuit means were identical with ends. The German state, deciding that the Jews should not live, arrogated to itself the judgment as to whether a whole people had the right to existence, a judgment that no man and no state have the right to make. In doing so, it subverted fundamental moral principles and every system of law that had governed, however imperfectly, human society for millennia. All right, so that's a historical perspective. I want now to return to France, to someone who was born after the war, or at least grew up after the war, Alain Finkelkraut. And he is a provocative philosopher. He teaches history of ideas in the Department of Humanities. Just give you a sense of his sense of what the next generation is like, because obviously up until now I've been giving you people who lived through the war as well, albeit not necessarily in Europe. So he writes, lineage made me genocide's huckster, its witness and practically its victim. Before telling the story of my origins, I was simply an individual. Afterward, there appeared an unheard of character, like someone miraculously healed or a ghost. With this sort of investiture, like any other titles seemed wretched or ridiculous to me. Hence my remarkable lack of complexes. Most children, they say, like to invent an illustrious birth. They devote their secret dreams to changing parentage, to imagining an adventurous or princely family background to themselves. What need had I of such mythologies? What great lord, what bohemian artist could rival my ancestry? No more hyperbolic world existed than the one into which I had been born. My narcissism found its sustenance on the spot, and the fiction of my family romance always unfolded in the heart of my own family. Thus, there was no virtue in my ostentation. So what did he do? In this novel, the protagonist introduced, he writes, I forged a tragic spectacle from the tragedy of my people, and I was its hero. In short, I played at being persecuted and did so in the mode of pantomime with a purely ceremonious gesture that I carried off without actually compromising myself. I was a swashbuckler of the concentration camps. But why accuse myself? My date of birth alone explains this propensity to bombast. I was born too close to the Holocaust to be able to keep it from view. And at the same time, I was protected by all the horror of this event from a renewal of anti-Semitism, at least in its organized and violent form. So this is a really, I think, provocative way of thinking about that generation that is born after the war, when for a period at least, anti-Semitism largely is suppressed. A different but equally provocative approach can be seen from Esther Disherit, who was born in 1952 in Germany. She's a poet, a novelist, an essayist, teacher, stage and radio dramatist. And she writes in a piece called No Exit from This Jewry about what it's like to be growing up in West Germany, knowing that she's a Jew. And so again, I'll give you some sense of it. In other instances, those who administered the West German restitution program to the victims, let me call them restitutors, were the same persons who, prior to 1945, had been designated to confiscate the property that was to be made Aryan. Thus, a Jewess who is on public assistance will be the same as any other person, and yet will be a Jewess. German as a language is the same to me too, and yet not the same. Not all words are equally available to me. For example, the word ramp. I simply cannot use that word anymore. Not for anything. You know, furniture is usually sold from a store and is picked up from a ramp or transported to and from trucks on ramps. It is impossible for me to hear someone say that he is fetching his furniture from the ramp. My hair and my hands become Jewish. Okay, so she also writes, I think very movingly, about people who moved to Germany, who are Jewish, who didn't grow up there, right? She says, I often had that feeling that human beings in the new communities, right, are at ease with each other. They wear the Magen David above their shirts. I wear it underneath. Was I a coward or pathologically? Finally, I noticed the difference between survivors. Those who had emigrated to Germany had not lived among normal, in quotes, Nazi Germans. Those dispersed refugees who had come to Germany from elsewhere after the end of the Second World War hadn't either. Nor finally had those few who had survived the concentration camps. None of these groups had experienced the normalcy of a Nazi German every day. I, on the other hand, am the child of a woman who survived Nazi Germany right among the Nazis, one of those improbable 5,000. My mother heard an accountant's normal prejudices, which could have had deadly consequences, felt the power of the owner of a ration card, the eyes of the legalized vigilantes who had been installed in every city block to watch over it. I never became unself-conscious about being Jewish in Germany. When we take the streetcar, my daughter tells me loudly, much too loudly, about the Passover preparations in kindergarten, and I look right and left. I always look over my shoulder. So these are, I think, examples that give you a sense of some of the experiences of Jews growing up in Germany, as well as in France after the war, and how their responses, excuse me, how their responses differ, right? I think between Wright and Finkelkraut, there is an enormous gap, but that's part of what helps us to understand responses to the Holocaust. It's no one easy answer. Okay, I now want to go to another piece of fiction because I think it's really very moving. Excuse me a second. So Imre Kertész was a child during the Holocaust, and he's also a Nobel Prize winner. He wrote a novel called Coddish for a Child Not Born, and his description of coming to recognize himself as a Jew is really powerful. It's a spectacle that happens in a Hungarian village where I was sent for a summer vacation. This is during the war itself. Yes, there it was. I lived among Jews for the first time, he writes. Real, genuine Jews. I mean, not like Jews like we were, city Jews, Budapest Jews. That is to say, not Jews at all, but of course, not Christians either. We were the kind of non-Jewish Jews who still observe holy days, long fasts, or at least definitely until lunch. No, indeed, the village relatives, they were the real Jews. Prayer in the morning, prayer in the evening, prayer before food, prayer with the wine. Other than that, they were fine people, though unbearably boring, of course, for a little boy from Budapest. I believe the war had already started then. But as everything was still quiet and beautiful here, we were merely practicing darkening the windows. Hungary was the island of peace in a Europe that exploded in flames. And that image of Hungary, I think, is really powerful, which probably has more meaning for us today as we watch this war unfold in Ukraine, right? And yet can make plans to travel to Poland or whatever, because it's not Ukraine, right? So Hungary was an island. Here, he writes, it couldn't happen. What happened and is continually happening in, let's say, Germany or Poland or the Czech Protectorate or France or Serbia or Slovakia, in other words, everywhere else all around us. No, not here. How could it? Yes, one morning at my relatives, I opened the bedroom door unawares and then immediately turned back screaming, not out loud, though only within me, because I saw somebody monstrous, something awful that struck me as obscene, and for which, if only on account of my age, I was not prepared. I saw a bald woman in a red gown in front of a mirror. And it took a while until my confused and terrified head would identify that woman with my aunt, whom on other occasions I was accustomed to seeing with the strangely stiff and thin, but otherwise normal head of reddish hair. Then he goes on. Later on, when my Jewishness gradually began to assume more importance, that is to say, when the news began to spread that the condition usually carries the death penalty, probably so simply so I could grasp this incomprehensible and strange fact, that is, my being a Jew, in its appropriately strange, yet at least more familiar light, then I suddenly found myself understanding who I was. A bald woman in a red gown in front of a mirror. Okay. So Kertész, gives us, I think, the emotional dimensions here in his writing in response to the Holocaust. I want to move back quickly to another historian, Henry Feingold. He's a historian of American Jews. His first book he wrote on efforts to rescue Jews during the period from 1939 to 1941, when the United States was not at war. And later on, he wrote a book, actually it's a bunch of essays, a really very interesting group of essays called Bearing Witness, How America and Its Jews Responded to the Holocaust. And what he notes here is that underlying the response of Jewish victims and witnesses at the time is the assumption, an assumption about the world order so pervasive that we tend to forget that it is there at all. Jews believed then that there existed somewhere in the world, whether in the Oval Office or the Vatican or Downing Street, a spirit of civilization whose moral concern could be mobilized to save the Jews. The failure to arouse and mobilize that concern is the cause of the current despair regarding the role of Jewish witnesses and leads to the search for betrayers. It is an assumption that continues to hold sway in Jewish political culture, despite the fact that there is little in recent Jewish experience that might confirm the existence of such a force in human affairs. Right? And he goes on to include, there were, in fact, no alternatives, not on the domestic political scene and not in the international arena. The truth was that during the years of the Holocaust, Jewish communities were caught in the classic condition of powerlessness. That, by definition, means lack of options. This was true of American Jewry as well. All right. In that context, the central assumption of pre-Holocaust Jewish political culture becomes understandable. It was based as much on powerlessness as on residual messianic fervor or the universalism of democratic socialism that large members of the community adhered to. And then he goes on to criticize something which I think is still, with us today. The indictment of the witnesses, namely people like American Jews who were not directly caught up. The indictment of the witnesses is based on the old assumption that there exists such a spirit of civilization, a sense of humanitarian concern in the world that could have been mobilized to save Jewish lives during the Holocaust. It indicts the Roosevelt administration, the Vatican, the British government, and all other witnessing nations and agencies for not acting, for not caring, and it reserves a special indignation for American Jewry's failure to mobilize a spirit that did not, in fact, exist. It is an indictment that cannot produce authentic history. Perhaps that cannot really be written until the pain subsides. So with that, I just want to share a couple more examples of very recent responses, 21st century ones. This by the American architect Peter Eisenman, who designed this memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. If any of you have been there, you know that it's very powerful. It covers, as you can see from the photograph, it covers a huge amount of city land. But you also know that people come there and kids play games, right? They play like hide and seek and other things, in and around these stones. And that's potentially disturbing, but it is how indeed it is used by people living and visiting Berlin. The second memorial I want to show you is very different, by the British artist Rachel Whiteread. It's located in Vienna, and she decided to focus on the burning of books, picking up from the idea of Jews as people of the book. So it's in some ways it can be understood as a kind of inside out library that was erected in the year 2000. And finally, I want to conclude with Deborah Lipstadt's writing. As some of you may know, she has been made an ambassador to deal with anti-Semitism in the context of the United States. I mean, anti-Semitism abroad, but an ambassador in the context of the US. And the Posen Library has a selection from her writing about the trial that she endured in Britain, which in many ways, turned her, as it were, into a movie star. Right, the book led to the movie Denial, but Deborah Lipstadt writes, I think, very beautifully, and is an appropriate way to end. I had just finished teaching a class on the history of the Holocaust. Relaxed and upbeat, I was scheduled to talk to a student about her graduate work, and then spend the afternoon finishing a book proposal on my new research project, a study of how the Holocaust was represented in post-World War II America. And she did, in fact, finish that and publish it. It's called Holocaust, An American Understanding. It's a very good book. As I came into my office, my secretary told me that an express letter had just arrived from Penguin, the British publisher of my book, Denying the Holocaust, The Growing Assault on Truth and Memory, a scholarly study of Holocaust denial. Intrigued, I asked the waiting student if she would mind if I quickly glanced at the letter. After reading but a few lines, I laughed out loud. The student who was reviewing her notes looked up as I said, still chuckling, "This is really nuts." I explained that David Irving, the world's most prominent Holocaust denier, was threatening to sue me for libel for calling him a denier. In my book, I had devoted a couple hundred words to Irving, describing him as a Hitler partisan wearing blinkers, right, who distorted evidence, manipulated documents, and skewed and misrepresented data in order to reach historically untenable conclusions. I wrote that, and I quote, "On some level, Irving seems to conceive himself as carrying on Hitler's legacy. I considered him the most dangerous of the Holocaust deniers, because unlike other deniers who were known only for being deniers, Irving was the author of numerous books about World War II and the Third Reich, some of which were well regarded." There. When he was asked by a reporter, this is Lipstadt again writing, why all mention of the Holocaust had disappeared from a new edition of one of his books, he responded, "If something didn't happen, then you don't even need to dignify it with a footnote." He denied the use of gas chambers to systematically kill Jews, argued that there was no officially sanctioned Third Reich plan to annihilate European Jewries, and contended that Hitler was probably the biggest, this is quotes, was probably the biggest friend the Jews had in the Third Reich, close quote. He was the one doing everything he could to prevent nasty things from happening to them. This is also a quote from Irving. Irving considered survivors who asserted that they had seen gas chambers to be liars or charlatans. Given Irving's record, his threat seemed absurd. How, I wonder, could someone who had called the Holocaust a, quote, quotes, air quotes, legend, argue that he was a denier? And with that, I want to bring this to a close. I think that you get a sense of the enormous diversity of responses here and the way in which for us in the 21st century, Holocaust denial itself has become an expression of a response, an anti-Semitic response to the Holocaust that Jews now need to deal with. And I've given you some sense, I hope, also of the riches available in the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization, the diversity that you have from writings in fiction to writings in first-person memoir accounts, to historical interpretations that offer a really very broad perspective on these Jewish responses to the Holocaust in the years after 1945. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deborah, for that really fascinating presentation. I think we have time. We have roughly 10 minutes for questions.
Adam, do you prefer that people will write in the chat, or we are a small enough group to unmute
You tell me what you think works best.
Deborah, would you like people to actually
Sure, I'm open if people are willing to, to speak out. That's great, instead of writing. Sure.
That's wonderful. So maybe the easiest thing will be for people to raise hands. There is in the reaction button, just a raised hand a button. Maybe I can use the time to ask the first question.
Sure.
I'm especially interested in the vastness of the sources that you brought, from survivors to commentators to historians to second generation and philosophers and so on. And I'm wondering, where do we go from here? Third generation, fourth generation, literature, new literature. What is your vision of where are we going with that? If you can reflect a little bit on that.
Yes, sure. I think that, in the 21st century, there are certain elements that will endure, especially in terms of creative responses to the Holocaust. In other words, what Andr Schwartz opens up very early on, which is to say, imagining through his head as a writer, the possibility, even though he wasn't there, right, at all. This is all in his imagination. This, I think, is increasingly available, right? It's the opposite of Adorno saying you can't write poetry, right? There was no poetry after Auschwitz, and I think that will allow us to see things in new ways, right? Through the means of fiction or poetry. I didn't bring any poetry, but there's poetry there. I think that the first person experiences also of the third generation, the kind of thing that Wright writes about as second generation, but of somebody, whose mother lived through, right, the survived in Germany itself, which is really unusual, that there will be more of these interpretations brought by the third generation, what it's like to have grandparents, right, who were the survivors, right? How do they relate to them? How do they understand some of what they experienced as kids growing up, and how does that relate? And then, of course, there's no question that in terms of history, we're still engaged in re-examining things. I mean, there have been several recent new books, including one by a colleague of mine, Jeffrey Weidlinger, on the pogroms that take place in Ukraine right after World War I, 1919. And the ways in which, people had paid no attention to it. And now going back and writing a history of it, he sees the things that happened in World War II, the same kinds of techniques that are used for the first time to murder Jews in 1919. So I think the historical resonances of the war won't just remain with the war itself, but be brought by historians to help illuminate other elements of Jewish experience, and also in comparative terms of non-Jewish experience, comparative genocide. Yeah.
Let me ask a question as well, which is, so in making these selections, again, I presume you had to read very, very broadly in the literature of this period. Do you see in reading French and German and other writing by first generation, second generation about the Holocaust, do you see national patterns developing, that there is a particular French inflection or German inflection or Israeli inflection in terms of of
Yeah.
how writers deal with it, or is it instead, is it generational and other patterns which actually are overriding as opposed to sort of a particular national approach?
Okay, well, so that's a really, really good question. Thank you, Adam. There are certainly differences, what you're calling national differences, but related in part to culture and the language in which people are writing. I did not bring you anything written originally in Hebrew, right? Or Yiddish for that matter, or Ladino. And there's no question that the language and which encapsulates the culture affects how it is that people write. So while I may be a little reluctant to call them national differences, I would say that there are cultural differences grounded in part in the language and how, and therefore the experience of the people writing it. That I think is really important. Among the things that we're now facing with the 21st century, of course, is we have a very, very differently dispersed Jewish community, right? I mean, so there's no one's writing in Russian particularly anymore, right? And no one's because they've adopted other languages, and I only could bring a small sample of material. So the Jewish diaspora looks very different. Israel is its own melting pot with the predominance of Hebrew for the most part as the language that people write in, and I think that makes for it will make for, I should say, rather different kinds of responses going forward there. Yeah. But I can add that we did see certain themes emerging. Right? When we went, Holocaust was clearly one of the important themes that Nurit Geertz and I were concerned about when we went to collect the materials. We went looking for this diversity. When you come to look at it in the volumes themselves, what you see is these themes emerging in different sections, right? Because the volumes are structured by genre. So fiction, you have in one area, life writing, memoir in another, politics in a third, right? So they're structured separately. If you go to the website, you can see them in different configurations, depending on how you do searches and stuff like that. And David Roskies and Sam Kassow, who did the preceding volume that covers the Holocaust years, some of which material I drew from, like the Schwartz bar and stuff, used a similar broad range of concerns. One of the things that's really fantastic in their volume is being able to read Anne Frank's selection is followed by an account of the Farhud in Iraq. And so you see anti-Semitism not just in Europe under Nazis, but you also see it in Iraq at the same time. And bringing these together really helps to change how you understand what was happening. Yeah.
Deborah, do you have time for another question? I know you said you had to.
I have time for one more.
One more question.
Okay, yes.
Wonderful. So I actually wanted to ask you a question about, in the last about 10 or 15 years, there's been some literature on the Holocaust and fiction on the Holocaust that introduces comedy or dark humor in order to tell the stories of the Holocaust, usually in third or fourth generational family. I was wondering what your thoughts on this. Do you see it as a movement, or do you see it as something that's a present moment now? Is it something, how do you feel about it?
Okay, so I see it pretty much as representing a particular kind of moment. You see it with films, for example, and the creation of sort of comic or dark comedy versions of the Holocaust, and it's something I don't know that whether it will endure, but it definitely represents a particular moment. It's very different from the diverse genres that have emerged, so that, you know, something like Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which is a comics form of genre, you know, when it first came out, there were people who thought that was disrespectful. But in fact, you know, as time has gone on, people recognize that it was a very powerful way of dealing for him as a second generation, you know, child of survivors, to deal with it through his own creative means, which is very different from sort of the dark humor kinds of things. So I think we have to sort of separate the genres from the kind of humor that you're talking about, which I see as reflective of the particular moment. Most of it's late 20th, early 21st century. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We do have one more question, but I'm not sure if you have time.
Okay, well, what is it? Can I be very short?
Yes, of course. I think this question is just from Jill Murray. She just said, oh, there's one from Michael Levy. Have you come across any literature of the Holocaust which addresses the causes of anti-Semitism?
Oh yes, there's a lot of scholarship about that, and there's a lot of debate about what are the causes. In simplified terms, you know, I cited sort of the paganism, as it were, that Schwartz sees from Nazis. Others have argued, oh no, Nazis, you know, Nazism drew upon Christian sources. So there are debates about the sources of anti-Semitism behind the Holocaust among scholars and philosophers as well. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, thank you all. And it's pretty amazing via Zoom to be able to do all of this. And I do urge you to check out at least the digital version, you know, which is free and easily accessible in South Africa or China or wherever you are. Yeah, as it is here in the US. So.
Thank you so much. Very, very much appreciated for your time and that fascinating talk and your generous answering of our questions as well, and much appreciated. We hope to bring you to South Africa at some point, so we can do this in person.
In person, okay. All right, take care.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening for the first in our three-part series with the Kaplan Center and the Posen Library. Thank you so much, Deborah, for her time and her presentation. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Christina, for all of your background work. Of course, thank you, Tully, and everyone else at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center team who's been working around the background. We do hope you will join us for the next in the series on the 7th of June, also at 7 p.m. The Rise of Open and Hidden Nazism, Polish Jewish Reckoning with Danger and Powerlessness in the 1930s. And that will be with Professor Kenneth B. Moss, who is doing the 7th volume, of the Posen Library Journal. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us this evening. You will receive a recording of this video as well as links to the Posen Library once the recording is available. Thank you all and have a wonderful night.